So the objective of this video is to identify the suffrage movement and the major players of the suffrage movement, and we're also going to specifically look at the state of Tennessee and its role in the suffrage movement. So before we begin, let's review some of the things that we've learned so far in this module when it comes to the progressive movement. We talked about the first thing, or what are some of the major goals. We talked about 4 major goals of the progressive era. Protect social welfare was the first goal that we discussed. Then we talked about promoting moral improvement, creating economic reform, and fostering efficiency. We talked about the muckrakers being the reporters, the journalists who reported on the muck and the ugliness that was occurring during the Gilded Age, that during the Progressive Era these things were addressed and attempted to change. We talked about Upton Sinclair being a muckraker and how he wrote The Jungle and exposed the nastiness of the meatpacking industry. Another muckraker that we talked about, we did a little bit of this last module, was Jacob Riis. And Jacob Riis took photographs of tenement life in the slums and exposed what that looked like. We also talked about Teddy Roosevelt being the progressive president, offering Americans the square deal. In this, he became the modern presidency, really using his personality and his role as president to shape legislation in the United States. He was a conservationist. Under him, the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed. He also busted up bad trust. Remember that word, bad. And so that kind of goes into what ways was Teddy a progressive president. So the last thing we're going to talk about when we talk about the progressive era is suffrage. Suffrage is the right to vote. So suffrage, the definition is the right to vote. And the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, gave African American men added African American men to the people who had the right to vote. But it still left women out of the picture. One of the famous suffragists, someone who fights for suffrage for a particular group of people, was Susan B. Anthony. She was an abolitionist. She worked closely with another suffragist named Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They worked at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 to bring women's suffrage to the forefront of people's minds. Actually, in 1872, she was arrested for trying to vote in her hometown of Rochester, New York. She formed the National American Women's Suffrage Association, known as NASA for short, in 1890, and this organization would be instrumental in getting women the right to vote. In 1878, she presented to Congress an amendment to give women the right to vote, but it did not pass. Susan B. Anthony is crucial in the path to women's suffrage in the United States, but unfortunately she will not live to see the ratification of the 19th Amendment that gives women the right to vote. Another major player in the women's suffrage movement is Carrie Chapman Catt. She will succeed Susan B. Anthony as leader of NASA. She supervised dozens of campaigns to try to get women the right to vote, mobilized numerous volunteers. She had at least 1 million volunteers by the end and gave hundreds of speeches trying to get women the right to vote. Alice Paul initially worked with NASA. She had first worked in England with an English suffragist known as Pankhurst, Emmeline Pankhurst. Emmeline Pankhurst was known to use kind of radical ways, things like hunger strikes, to try to get the public attention for women in order to get them the right to vote. But because NASA wasn't going the direction that she wanted, and she didn't feel that they were acting aggressively enough, she separated from NASA and created her own party, the National Women's Party, in 1916. She wanted to directly petition for an amendment to the federal government, where Carrie Chapman Catt her as the leader of NASA wanted to petition state to state and work on states getting the rights to vote. Alice Paul wanted nothing to do with that. She wanted to go directly to the federal government and get an amendment. one of the struggles for the women's suffrage movement is in the height of them fighting and campaigning for this right, World War I breaks out. And at this time, it was very taboo, unheard of, for people to protest the government, especially the president, during the time of war. Everyone thought that you should be supporting your government and your president at a time of war. Alice Paul did not believe that. She felt that if we were fighting for democracy across the Atlantic, then women should have the right to democracy at home. So she continued to protest Wilson during World War I. She would organize her volunteers in the National Women's Party, or the NWP, to protest outside the White House. Her volunteers would be arrested, put in a workhouse, and once her volunteers were arrested, she then went out and protested, and Alice Paul was arrested as well. The women refused to pay the fine that they were charged because they felt that by paying the fine would be admitting their guilt. So while they were in the workhouse, Alice Paul went on a hunger strike, refusing to eat, hoping that if she died, she would become a martyr for the suffrage cause. They did not want her, the government did not want her to become a martyr, so they started to force feed her in an attempt to get her to eat so that she wouldn't die. And her efforts worked. Alice Paul would eventually her story would leak, and she would be released from the prison. Here are some pictures here of a protester being arrested, and you also have an image of what it would look like to be force-fed. Very uncomfortable. They would put a metal piece in your mouth to keep your mouth open, and then put a rubber tube down your throat and use a funnel to pour maybe beaten raw eggs in it, and they would directly put it into your stomach. Tennessee plays a huge role in the passage of the 19th Amendment, or the Suffrage Amendment. Anne Dallas Dudley, who you see pictured here on the right, founded the Nashville Equal Suffrage League in 1911. She would eventually serve as VP of NASA, and she worked to get the 19th Amendment passed in the state of Tennessee. He played a huge role in the passage of the 19th Amendment. But you had people that didn't necessarily agree with women having the right to vote, even women themselves. You have a woman named Josephine Pearson, and she was actually the leader of the anti-suffrage movement in Tennessee. She was the president of Tennessee State Association, opposed to women's suffrage, in the Southern Women's League for the rejection of the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. So Josephine Pearson did her best to try to prevent women from getting the right to vote. Al Roberts, who was the governor of Tennessee at the time that the ratification of the amendment came to a vote, he was the governor of Tennessee. He actually called a session to vote on the 19th Amendment, so he plays a huge role in the ratification of the 19th Amendment. When the men went in to vote yay or nay on the passage of the 19th Amendment, it truly looked like the nays were going to win, that suffrage was not going to pass in the state of Tennessee, and that the federal government would not have the majority of states passing it, therefore the 19th Amendment wouldn't pass. But there was a young legislator from the from the county of McMinn County in Tennessee. His name was Harry T. Byrne. He was a very young kid, a young gentleman, and he was initially going to vote nay, and his mother wrote him a telegram where she said, "Hooray and vote for suffrage. Don't keep them in doubt. I noticed some of the speeches against. They were bitter. I have been watching to see how you stood, but have you not noticed anything yet? Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Capp put the rat in ratification. Your mother." Because of this telegram from his mother, he will vote yay, and Tennessee will vote for the ratification of the 19th Amendment, making Tennessee the 36th state to vote for the ratification of the 19th Amendment. 36 were the number of states that were needed in order to make it a constitutional amendment. So now Tennessee is known as the Perfect 36. I quickly want to speak a little bit about Woodrow Wilson. We'll talk more about Woodrow Wilson when we talk about World War I. Woodrow Wilson would be president from 1913 to 1921. He truly believed in a smaller government, but his new freedom, which is what he ran on, would be a smaller government, but that would not last for long. He would he would push for the passage of the Underwood Tariff Act in 1913. This was tariff reform. He also pushed for the institution of a federal income tax and also lowered the tariff rates. Remember, we talked about how the tariffs were lowering, and so a federal income tax had to be passed. You also have the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. This was a form of banking reform. It set up the Federal Reserve System, a central banking system in the United States, and the authority to issue federal notes, or the dollar. He also, under the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, you have the Clayton Antitrust Act, which was business reform. It's going to expand on the Sherman Antitrust Act, which hadn't been as successful, and it starts to define trust and monopolies a little bit more, not just activities, but conduct as well that looked like a monopoly could be seen as illegal.